Hello and welcome to One on One. I'm Vernon Ramsar, and today we continue our conversation with Dr. Roger Pulwarty, climate scientist and Director of the National Integrated Drought Information System at NOAA. Welcome back, having gone nowhere, because you're wearing the same clothes and the same tie.
Ah, yes. Continuity is important.
Well, I want to sort of personalize a little bit now, because obviously you're here as a guest of Nehurst to talk at the CYSF, that's the Caribbean Youth Science Forum, on climate, obviously. But how does a nice climate scientist like you end up from Trinidad at the very highest levels of climate science research in the U.S.?
So from one of the things we can look back on the past here, I mean, Trinidad has such a very, very high and high quality level of elementary and high school education. This helps shape a lot of people's interests. But it shapes our interests in a certain way, in a very sort of academic way. The interest really came from growing up in a very rural village where most of the people were engaged in agriculture. And the first thing that you see, of course, is that they're affected by rain. They're affected by dryness. And that begins to start asking questions, well, what makes a crop a better thing, growing up within the whole setting of an agricultural community? But as important to that, for me, was the whole idea that I always thought, growing up in a place like Trinidad,
I think it was McBean in particular.
I grew up in McBean, just north of Cuba, right? And the old southern main road, as it used to be called, was that we lived on an area that my dad farmed for recreational purposes, oranges, not the modern recreational things that people do. Right?
We won't talk about that.
Not about those, right? But oranges, mangoes, and so on. What did those bring? They brought birds. They brought animals. This was fascinating to me. The diversity of wildlife in Trinidad, I thought, was a miracle. So you grew up with that. And you grew up, I think if we look at one of the NGOs that Mark DeVita runs, like Papa Boa. What is Papa Boa? That's the magic of the woods, the father of the woods. These kinds of myths and so on help shape, from my standpoint, an understanding that we were intrinsically tied to our place, our physical place, our ecosystems, and they construct us and they shape us. Of course, I can comment on that much later in life, but then I began to realize that that's in fact what shaped the interest, the location of where we were.
Which must have run counter to your family, because all the Indian families I know in Trinidad, you're going to be a doctor or you're going to be a lawyer.
So from the standpoint, or an engineer.
Or an engineer, I forgot about that. Yeah.
So the issue too was that wasn't just among the Indians, that in our system of education was basically the choices. If you want to become a professional, that's what you're going to be. You're going to pick one of those three things. One of at least the really fortunate things I had was a set of older brothers and sisters who themselves are highly accomplished. And the idea was that asking questions and being able to answer and engage in the questions you wanted to was completely allowed. So the idea of just either becoming a doctor, lawyer, or engineer was, to me, one of many choices. It was encouraging. I was fortunate to have it. But we do have to remember that growing up in that time, across the board, not just in Indian families, those were the choices that were available. We couldn't imagine ourselves being way more engaged as we are now, and the opportunities have been created, that we'd be engaged in questions of the environment, valuing the environment, transforming it not just for human use, but for the value of the systems themselves. That, I think, is a recent recognition in our country.
So from that childhood experience, you somehow ended up sitting across from President Obama. There must be something in between.
Some of the briefings we have, in between those leaps, as you mentioned them, and the fortuitous nature of such, is the learning that takes place. What do we need to respond to the changing environment? As I mentioned, I grew up in a very small village. It's a wonderful place to learn and be educated. What I learned most of all was a sense of responsibility from my family to other people where we lived. It's the very first thing. It drives a sense of doing science, getting information, learning, so that it makes yours and other people's lives better off. That push, whether or not I'm doing it successfully is still in question, is really the driver. Did I create that myself? No. My society did, the places I'm from, the teachers I had. I went to one of the Canadian Mission elementary schools in Couva.
Exchange?
Right, Exchange.
So did I, actually.
Then to Presentation College. the shaping of both those systems of education and having a supportive family allowed me to ask the questions that I wanted to ask, which is, how do we understand the ecosystems, the people, the cultures we have, and how might one sustain them? To me, growing up in Trinidad was fascinating. I see the resistance maybe in some cases not to fully engage in some areas of the environment, but growing up, Caroni Swamp, River Swamp, these were places of magic. I wondered what wildlife, what creatures lived in there, what landscapes were in there. Not because I was a budding scientist, because I found it fascinating. And so from that standpoint, I think the natural environment of Trinidad has a lot to do with how it shapes us. I also want to make sure that I put in the fact that Trinidadians seem to be irreverent, but the sense of humor is always there. And especially in things like Calypso, from Portrait of Trinidad to Progress. These are all things that help shape the outlook. So it's a unique mix that allows us to be adaptable in other parts of the world. And from that standpoint, getting engaged in science, choosing the field that I did, yes, that leads to certain contributions one can make, but to say a cliche, you don't forget where you're from.
Mm-hmm. But in terms of, I'm not sure how old you are, but certainly you're no spring chicken, but was climate science even a thing when you were younger?
It's an excellent question. I was interested in the environment, and the thing that got me interested was actually working at the Caroni Research Station as an assistant and agricultural extension officer and collecting rainfall data. This was a big piece. Now, people might not remember, a lot of folks might not remember, some will, that the research station was actually part of what used to be the Imperial College of Tropical Agriculture, one of the best schools in the world. From that standpoint, taking the measurements of how our environment changes and varies day to day became a very fascinating thing for me. It was not, I had no idea this was climate science. It was
meteorology, I guess.
What was meteorology at the time. And for us, as people know, if you did meteorology, your natural transition was to become a weatherman. And so the issue that it's a career in research, but more importantly, it is also one that affects our aviation, our agriculture, or water resources. That came much later. But the interest of doing this actually came from understanding and being in an agricultural community whose day-to-day activities were affected by weather.
I've only been talking to you for a short time, the last hour, but it seems to me that your range of interests is huge and rather varied. It's not just about climate. I suppose climate in itself is so complex, it involves any number of things. But you seem to have a wide range of interests in things in the world, literature. Would I be correct in that assumption?
An interest, yes. Yes, I dabble in a lot of stuff. Yeah. I've published in about 9 different disciplines with different groups. But what does that actually mean in terms of context? What it means is this. It's not so much a diverse interest, but the willingness to ask, if I need to solve a problem, whether it is what crops do we plant or how do we manage water resources, I ask what tools, what methods, what disciplines do I need to acquire in order to help me understand that problem. That gives a breadth that is a problem solving, a multiple method approach that allows you to draw the answers you need, as opposed to walking in and say, I'm an engineer, the problem must be engineering. Mm-hmm. I'm a physicist, the problem must be physics. So instead, it's the old saying, if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. The issue is, what's the question and what tools, methods, techniques do we need to answer them? That creates a broad interest that says, what's the solution? Well, it's physical, social, and decision making. So we get the tools and techniques behind that, literature included.
No, I understand, I wasn't part of it, but you gave a fascinating chat to some young people this morning on the Enlightenment from a different perspective. Tell me about that.
So one of the things I was trying to bring to this discussion was that we had the scientific revolution, Newton, Lavoisier, others, leading to the Enlightenment. What role should science really play? If it is not to preserve human dignity and freedom, and it's just to produce technical widgets so we can download things, the highest purpose of human nature is not just to assimilate data, it's to live freer lives. And the Enlightenment, actually, that form of the Enlightenment, allowed us to think of human progress as open to us. As we grow up in the region, we're accustomed to being recipients of knowledge created somewhere else. We get textbooks, and that's fixed knowledge. We're not learning, well, for years, we were not asked to be critical of what we're seeing. Where does that idea come from? How is it being learned? What data and information is being put into it? So from this morning, the Enlightenment actually taught us to do that. What did it bring? Burgeoning art, culture, and a notion that progress was only limited by how much you could imagine it. The freedom to think about, as Mandela said, the mind is the greatest resource in the world. Right? The freedom to think that way is what I was getting at this morning. And the freedom not just to acquire, but to learn for the purpose of serving humanity. This was one of the awakenings in the Enlightenment. From my standpoint, as we go through in the Caribbean, trying to accumulate knowledge, practices, so on, the end result should be to preserve the dignity of our people in the region and to preserve the economies, the environments that we have. If it doesn't translate into that, then all we have are tools. We're not making a difference in people's lives. There's a lot of lessons from the Enlightenment to be learned in that context, but in the context of the Caribbean.
Now, if we speak of the original Enlightenment, of course, there was always a clash with religion in that particular instance. Do you foresee that as a problem to science in the Caribbean?
So this morning, one of the definitions I gave of the Enlightenment was the classic sort of the Enlightenment being that period in which there was this burgeoning of art, science, but also gave another definition of enlightenment, which comes from the religious background, which is gaining insight, knowledge, and some people would say spirituality, to help end human suffering. These goals are not at odds, and there's no we can argue forever which of these approaches is right, but both goals are to increase freedom and at least try to limit suffering. As long as we're engaged in that, I think we're partners in this.
I think most religions now don't argue with the basics of science anymore. I think we've passed that stage over the last few hundred years.
Hopefully.
Well, we can only hope.
Yes.
Getting back to climate science now and climate change, we know some of the problems that you outlined in the previous part of this interview, which is CO2 emissions, changes in the basic functioning of our planet and how climate is emerging and changing over time. But what can we do to fix it? I've heard some people say it's too late to do anything about it at this point.
So from the standpoint of what can we do, there's a question to be asked is, well, what have we been doing? We don't need to start from scratch. You have things like the Barbados Program of Action from 1994, the Lillendal Declaration, the regions, the Caribbean Met and Hydro Services, the Caribbean Met Office, are all engaged in developing what is called the Global Framework on Climate Services, the information, techniques, and tools that are needed for us to help respond to risk. Critically among those groups are the heroes in our society, the Mark de Batailles, the Molly Gaskins, and people like that, who keep us aware that changes are occurring, the folks in Matura who watch the turtles, right? What I'm at by saying this is that we have a lot of lessons and innovations in our region that we haven't fully drawn on. The Caribbean has created one of the most innovative regional plans of actions to address climate change. It's indeed transformative. It basically says, is this the direction we want to go with energy? How will we develop the resource needed to help sustain tourism, but work with the tourist industry on reducing its impact of waste, water use and efficiency, operating hotels in a way that, that use both less water and energy, and innovation such as the Caribbean Catastrophic Risk Insurance Facility. We have a network of pieces being developed over time that we can point to. Introductions by the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Group on how we get climate into disaster risk reduction, and by people right here in the Trinidad office of the Red Cross. So I think we have these lessons around. What we have not been doing is being as clear that these activities are there. How do we support, secure, and legitimize the ones that are working well? So from that standpoint, I think we can look at how we improve disaster risk reduction, how we engage in energy efficiency, what it means to empower communities to act for themselves, not simply be, again, recipients of outside ideals. And probably one of the most important things that you could see in the Caribbean Youth Science Forum, pulling together a cadre of future professionals who see the world this way. There's nothing more encouraging and aspirational than knowing that other folks share your values and want to ask the same questions. From that standpoint, I think we're doing, if you asked me this question 10 or 15 years ago, I would have given you a much darker response. But I once, as someone asked me one day, well, given all this climate stuff, are you a pessimist? And I said, I once thought about being a pessimist, and I thought that's not going to work. So the idea is that there is strength and encouragement. We've learned things over time, and our lessons are being embedded in the questions of people and students that I'm seeing at the forum.
I agree with what you say about the community work. People in Matura, for example, gripping a problem and dealing with it on a community level with a successful outcome, a very successful outcome. Or people like Mark, who are always on this program, doing work. But you're also living in a country that has the carbon footprint of a gorilla, one of the worst in the world, and also a deforestation problem in the Northern Range as we go quarrying for more aggregate to build the buildings that we're building. Do you think there's much more to be done on the basis of Trinidad and Tobago alone?
So, as you know, very recently there was a huge agreement to do a series of investments in Trinidad on renewables. I think there's never a full 100% offset of renewables now with fossil fuels. The move towards things like natural gas has actually reduced our fossil fuel footprint. What I think you're getting at, which I fully agree with, and this is why in the earlier conversation I raised this issue of our interaction with the environment and our surroundings. What we want to move to is basically a culture of risk management, that people see themselves contributing to making a better nation and a better country on an individual basis. What does that lead to? That's what led to recycling over the years, right? This didn't happen by accident. So we have to ask, are we always prone to looking backwards and saying, oh, that's when that change occurred? Or are there things we can do in place to help presage those things? From us, more efficient technology, working on the education systems that ask us, why do people adopt efficient techniques, water, lights, and so on, working with how we manage our drains or floods. This, I think, has much more to do with not just education, but how we've socialized our lessons, that is someone else's responsibility over time. That latter is the biggest driver. It's not someone else's responsibility. It's our own. I'm actually much more optimistic in terms of where we are going in the future. Strengthening our protected areas is critical. As I mentioned earlier, it shapes our minds. The moment we think that rates of deforestation contribute greatly to siltation of water, to the loss of water quality, more globally to environmental change, right? The feedbacks to CO2. But it loses us our sense of place. And I think one of the things we have to ask is how much we're made up of, not just the cities and towns that we're from, but the natural environment around us, the things we've come to know and love for being from this island and from being Tobago as well. I think getting at that and strengthening our rules and laws on the protected areas is really critical. Relieving the pressures for those resources, right? New manufacturing, right? Other modes of tools and techniques that I think actually we can get into that are more related to synthetics would be really valuable.
So basically we have your childhood experience in McBean being reflected on a global level now, and how the U.S. in particular.
McBean was the world.
Well, no, I mean, but McBean, it could be, I suppose. But it's amazing how a childhood experience can shape
precisely
world policy and international policy and national policy.
So there's a whole set of literature and research led by folks at Yale and elsewhere that says, how does personal psychology become rules, laws, traditions, and cultures over time? This is very interesting, right? Because more and more we're connected to people around the world. And learning, in some cases, people think, oh, we're more connected. Well, maybe we're only connecting to people that think like us.
Yeah,
right? So it's much more it can be more isolated. I always remember in growing up and reading the mysteries of things like Agatha Christie, in which in her village, she would find someone that acted like the person she was investigating, right?
Very, very
Our
true.
worlds are they're microcosms, right? They're made up of people with values and aspirations that want to lead better lives and want better lives for their children. That's around the world. And so understanding the importance of people, no matter what station, was the first thing I learned from my parents. That matters around the world. How does that filter to the broader questions? Not simply that you want to act on behalf of others, but you want to make sure that your contribution to the world is not a negative one.
Do you think we should take some hope from the experience we had as the world with how we handle the ozone layer and CFCs? Because that seems to be resolving itself to some extent now because of the world suddenly took notice of it.
Well, they took notice, but there were other things that were happening at the time. The companies that were involved, the big ones in particular, a lot of the agreements came after they'd actually found an alternative. And this is really critical, right? The agreements came and were shaped by seeing the ozone hole, which is very critical. We call those things in research focusing events, things that draw the attention of people and leadership, right? So that was something you could see. With things like climate change, we can't wait till they happen to respond to them. That's one difference. The other is the alternatives had been to CFCs had actually been created by that time. So there was somewhere else to go. From our standpoint, and you'd asked this question earlier, which is a salient issue, the alternatives in energy, water efficiency, protected areas exist. We need to put those into place as economically and socially viable alternatives.
But some of the alternatives aren't as efficient right now as they could be.
So right now they're not as efficient. I always like to tell people efficiency means climbing the ladder at each rung. Wisdom means knowing if the ladder is leaning at the right wall, right? And what we want to be able to get at is not a pseudo-efficiency either. We want to be able to get people thinking in terms of how to get the best out of their resources, how to get the values that they need. In other words, increasing, our food import in the region is about $3 billion a year, right? Until about 1970, we were net exporters of food. That's a transition that occurred in a region, not a positive transition, that we have to ask the question, okay, then how do we meet the needs for food production in our region? Not just agriculture, but food security, what it means to communities. How critical is that? As we shifted from large-scale agriculture, from bananas and sugar, more pushing towards tourism, the tourist industry also requires a lot of food, much of which on the other islands we import. Our markets for small goods and small local fruits are not yet as well developed as they should be. That's a key avenue that helps us both with food security and ensuring a tourism industry that is viable. So I think efficiency is one criteria, values are a whole other. And efficiency by itself is not a substitute for value. We choose to be efficient based on the outcomes we want. And what I mean by that is, do we want a more food secure world for our children, for the people that we love, the country to whom we feel indebted? Do we want them to be water secure, to be environmentally secure? Yes. What's the pathways for getting there? How do we engage both communities and the public and private sectors in that goal? You mentioned earlier the, I think, very, very visionary approach of the administration, getting these large companies engaged in the climate initiatives. From that standpoint,
graphic here.
From that standpoint, there's a change. There's a change that is actually meaningful, visible, and has engaged extremely powerful interests in meeting a goal that helps to reduce the risk to humans over time. So these things do happen.
Well, we need good science behind it as well, because sometimes we may think we're doing something that's good for the environment, but in fact, it's just window dressing, isn't it? I mean, I'm thinking I read somewhere that the Prius actually uses more inputs and more
in terms of building
in the long term.
Well, the life cycle of it seems to add up to a whole lot more. But I think the richer point that you're making is this: when do we know our assumptions about what we're doing are failing? No one answer lasts for all time. How robust are the solutions that we're putting into place? That requires research, ongoing research. The most critical thing we're seeing right now are rapid transitions in our environment. The question is, what's the capability and the ability of our communities to respond on the time scale that's needed? We're known for what I call crisis learning and redesign. An event happens, wow, it's a crisis, we respond. And that's not just in the Caribbean, that's the nature of disaster risk reduction around the world. And then we respond,
Katrina, for example,
and we put something into place. Well, the question is, to what point do we ask people to be proactive? And what are the benefits for being proactive? Not simply the upfront economic costs, but in fact, we're appealing to greater values that drive us, right? Our sense of place, the environment, and having a future for the people that you care about. This is really critical because, as you were saying, many of our adaptations, many of the things we put into place can sometimes mislead us. We can reduce a small risk and expose ourselves to a big risk. In the case of the levees, as you mentioned, in Katrina, the moment you control the smaller floods, we induce development into those areas, exposing yourself to a big event when it does happen. The fact that climate has never been stable should help us rethink this idea that managing through one period, such as quiet periods of hurricane occurrences, should not lead us to think that those changes aren't going to come back. A lot of the development in the east coast of the US and throughout the Caribbean occurred during relatively quiet periods of hurricane variability. Begin to change, you see more frequent ones driven by variability, not simply climate change, but by variability. But we hadn't taken them truly into account. So now we're dealing much more with emergency management than upfront planning.
Well, Dr. Roger Pulwarty, a climate scientist, it's been a great pleasure having you on the program. I want to thank you so much for being here.
Thanks very much.
Hope to meet you again soon. Thank you very much indeed. You've been
Excellent.
watching One-on-One. Join us again tomorrow for another edition.